How many of you like a good drama? Or do you like living in drama? I was talking a little bit to my wife and my daughter Mary about Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Maybe some of you saw that musical. It was the best one was when Donny Osmond was playing the main part of Joseph. And it's an interesting kind of take on Joseph in this story of Joseph. The Pharaoh is played by a Elvis impersonator. And there's details that are kind of in that story or that musical and detail that's taken out. It's just a really nice, I guess, musical if you're into musicals. I grew up with westerns and war movies and hockey. And I married into musicals. But all of us, at some point in time, just kind of love a good drama. I mean, when you think about it, there's nothing like a good soap opera, because when we watch something like that, we are kind of thinking, I'm so glad they're going through all of that and I'm not. If you used to watch Dallas or Dynasty or maybe General Hospital, I think Rick and Laura is still going after 40 years or something. Or maybe you've been watching reruns of Downton Abbey. See, in our society, we love the drama. Because in the drama, there's brokenness. And yet, when we look at the life of Joseph, we see that he's living a life of spiritual integrity through his brokenness. And throughout the story of Joseph, Jacob, the brothers, Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar, Pharaoh, we see the brokenness of their lives. Brokenness is the damage done as a result of sin. Sometimes brokenness is self-inflicted sin. We have made choices in our life, and as a result, we are continuing to kind of live out the consequences of some of those sinful choices. Or maybe it happens because of some sort of, I guess, circumstance where we receive brokenness. There's a downturn in the economy. There's a drought. There's mismanagement or dictatorial policies of a government. And as a result, we suffer from it. There is also that sin that happens from others. That kind of brokenness. Who have hurt us, who have abused us, have taken advantage of us, stolen from us, kind of got ahead of us in something. In a sense, we've been sinned upon. And that brings brokenness in our life, especially from those who we thought we could trust. But throughout this story, we see the brokenness of these people. But we also see the story of God in this brokenness. If you turn to Genesis chapter 37, you see the first point I want to make is the dreamer. And I decided to do some alliteration. And most preaching professors today want us to avoid alliteration, but I like breaking their rules. Because this outline came to me as I was driving on the 401, so I knew that was from God very clearly. So in chapter 37, verses 1 to 12, we are introduced to the dreamer, Joseph himself. And here in these first few verses, it says in verse 1 of Genesis 37, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him, coated with colors. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I've had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and the 11 stars are bowing down to me. When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph is 17 years of age. He was the favorite of his father Jacob. And he has these dreams. And he tells his brothers and his parents that they would all bow down to him someday. Wouldn't that be something around the family table? This kind of young guy, the second youngest, is telling all the older brothers who are all, kind of working hard and doing their father's work and helping on the farm, hearing from this brother Joseph, the guy who not only looks good, but he dresses nice too, about the dream. We see Joseph's brokenness here. Joseph's brokenness begins with tattletaling on his brothers and his insensitivity and his arrogance about what God has told him. Joseph takes God's gifts and dreams and turns them into self-promotion. As a result, he needs to learn humility since he is enslaved himself personally through what he's just done. See, God has a vision and a purpose for everyone. I want you to understand that this morning. That God has a vision, He has a dream, and a purpose for everyone. But our enemy wants to destroy God's purpose and vision in our lives. He wants to sideline us. He wants to kind of murder those dreams and basically have us go in a direction of destruction rather than go in the ways of God. And as we see, Joseph has to learn some lessons. His brothers have to learn some lessons. His father has to learn some lessons in order to see God's dream and purposes carried out in their lives. So there's the dream. And then there's the dugout. Genesis 37:12-36, where we see him being sent out by his father to go see what his brothers are doing, basically. And he goes, and his brothers see him coming, the dreamer, and they plot to kill him right there on the spot. But one of his brothers kind of intervenes and says, we can't do that. So they throw him in a cistern or a dugout. Now it's empty, fortunately, because some of the cisterns I've seen in the Middle East are places that can have 50,000 to 80,000 gallons of water. And people at that time didn't have a lot of water around them, so they didn't really need to learn how to swim. So fortunately, on that day, the cistern's dry. And they throw Joseph into it. You see Joseph's brothers' brokenness. They're enslaved by jealousy. They want to deal with him. He's the favorite of Jacob's, which is also showing Jacob's brokenness. And Joseph's brothers finally sell him into slavery, tell Jacob that Joseph was killed by a ferocious animal. They dip the coat into the blood and think they can get away with it. But we see all the way through Scripture that evil actions never avoid accountability. God always catches up with people. And sin always catches up with people. And we'll see this as things catch up with these brothers as they deal with Joseph in this way. Jacob is broken by the loss, And instead of embracing his sons, he makes Benjamin his next favorite, because he's the son from the wife that also bore Joseph. And so you see the brokenness continuing in the life of this family. Joseph is thrown in the cistern, he's sold, and there he is in his own brokenness. He experiences death of a dream, right? God's told him the dream in his life. He maybe doesn't understand it all, but he knows that someday, somewhere, his brothers, his family are going to bow down to him. It's an amazing story. But God has to do some work in Joseph's life. God uses difficulties or brokenness to develop our character and our dependence on God. And sometimes we go through the death of a dream in order for us to experience the pain or brokenness of this world or whatever happens in our life or the choices we make in our life, so that God kind of gets our attention. How many of you have had the death of a dream before? Yeah. It's a hard thing. There's loss, there's hurt, there's a whole number of things that goes on with death of a dream. And then as you kind of go through all that pain and all that difficulty, God keeps working things out, because the amazing thing about God to me is that He's always working behind the scenes for us. And sometimes death of a dream just turns us right around to following God in a new way. But Joseph has some lessons to learn as a young leader. So in Genesis 39 and 40 and 41, I call it the dungeon. Joseph is sold as a slave to an Egyptian leader, Pifer. And God just uses him there in that particular household. And pretty soon Potiphar entrusts him with his whole household. He's basically managing this key Egyptian official, all of his business dealings, all of those kinds of things. Joseph is looking after them. He is like in his early 20s doing this. But there are broken people there too. Because as we find out, Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar just aren't doing so well. Okay? They're broken. And Potiphar is broken by the betrayal of a trusted servant, but he's really broken by the betrayal of his wife. And his wife is broken by sexual sin. She tries to seduce Joseph, falsely accuses him, he takes off, but her accusations stick. And as a result, Potiphar puts Joseph in the very prison that he oversees. And I don't think that's a mistake. It's an amazing, amazing part of God's plan for Joseph's life. In prison, Joseph gets a reputation not only for the hard work he does, and he rises to the top where basically he's assistant to the warden there, and he's overseeing prisoners who are coming in and out. All those kinds of things, Joseph has been given responsibility. And it says over and over again in those passages, the Lord was with Joseph. Isn't it exciting to go to prison for Jesus? Or for the Lord's word, or God's part of God's plan in your life. I've met different people who've been in prison, and that's where God has spoken to them the most. And they have come to Christ, and as a result, their life has changed. Because that's the grace of God. Some of us are in our own dungeons. Some of us are in our own brokenness, and we feel like we're in prison. But we forget, as followers of Jesus Christ, God uses spiritual tests to strengthen our trust in Him, because the Lord is still with us no matter what we're going through. But you notice something about Joseph? Joseph chooses the dungeon rather than to be sidelined by sin. He chooses the dungeon rather than being sidelined by sin. He knows that even though these circumstances of life are going this way with him, If he chooses sin, and he says it here, why should I, sin against God? He says in chapter 39 and verse 11. Why should I do this wicked thing and sin against God? Why should I do this? My master has held nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. And he refuses. And then he hits prison. There are times in our lives where I think we treasure our sin. Self-inflicted, treasured sin is willful, ongoing disobedience, as one of my friends said. Self-inflicted, treasured sin is willful, ongoing disobedience. Basically, a person says something like this. Yes, I love Jesus, but that's just the way I am. I'm an angry person. Or I'm a critical person. Or this is just the way God made me. There's no changing me. And so we kind of treasure our sin. Or Joseph could have chose to sin and then kind of treasure it. Well, I was in an awkward place. I just had to do it. Or so as he heads back into this dungeon day after day, maybe he could have fallen into the trap of an endless self-pity because of the sin of others toward him. And it's easy for us sometimes to fall into this kind of pattern or sin of self-pity because we've gone through brokenness, we've had people sin against us, and as a result, it goes into bitterness or envy, so it hinders God's grace, His forgiveness, and the healing He wants to give to our life, and the direction He wants to give it to our life, because we fall into self-pity. Sin is not a badge of honor. Bitterness, self-pity, and unforgiveness are not badges of honor. Forgiveness, grace, and love are marks of maturity in Jesus Christ. There's an interesting story in John chapter 5, verses 1 to 15. Jesus is at the pool of Siloam. It was a place just outside the walls of Jerusalem that people could go. It was actually near kind of an underground river, and you can still walk through that underground river today. It's kind of carved out, but there was a pool there with steps and kind of a really nice patio. And you can go to that place, and I remember standing in that place and recalling this story. And there was a man that Jesus encounters who's been laying there for 38 years, waiting for the waters to be stirred, because what they thought was when the waters at that pool were stirred, if you could just get in, it would heal you. And this man was waiting there for 38 years for someone to just kind of push him in. Push him in. And then Jesus says something to him that just hits me. I've asked this of some people as I've counseled or talked with them too. And it's just 6 words, 6 simple words with a question mark. And Jesus asked him this question: do you want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? And he says, I have no one to put me in the water when it's stirred. He just waited for somebody to come along, get him in. He can't even roll in himself, I guess. He's so paralyzed with what's going on in his life. And Jesus says, do you want to be healed? And then Jesus says, get up, take your mat and walk. And he does. It just happens that it happens on a Sunday, on the Sabbath. And of course the Pharisees are all over that, because you know what? We shouldn't be doing good on the Lord's Day, ever. To them. We need to be miserable going to church. And just follow the rules. Healing people, helping people, that's not really what we do. But that's what Jesus does. And I believe the local church needs to be more of a healing place, where we ask that question. And we bring Jesus into our lives more to see Him touch us and help our brokenness and heal it and bring us into a relationship with Him. Joseph's there. I'm sure maybe I don't know if he was like this, but if you ever see prison movies, they're always kind of marking the next day. They get 5 days, they're marking it on the wall. I don't think Joseph is like that. I think he's just waiting for God to give him the next opportunity. And that's what he does. The dynasty is talked about in Genesis chapter 41 to 57. It's a big section, but it's a pretty cool section because, there he is. We see the brokenness of Pharaoh. We see the brokenness of the baker. We see the brokenness of the wine taster that Pharaoh has. And then Joseph just helps these guys out in interpreting their dreams in prison. He is hoping that the baker and the steward, the wine steward, will remember him. Now, the baker's dream is kind of a hard deal. I always love hearing this part of the story because he's got 3 baskets of baked goods on his head. So, seeing that is kind of interesting, but then realizing there's birds coming down and eating it, and Joseph gives him the interpretation of the dream. You only have 3 days to live. And the other guy has a dream too. He's squeezing out the grapes for the Pharaoh. And Joseph says to him, well, you have 3 days too, but Pharaoh's going to restore you. Remember me. And then it says that he had forgotten, and Joseph is in the prison dungeon for another 2 years. 2 years. Then we find out about the brokenness of Pharaoh. It's about fear and national collapse. He has troubling dreams that none of his wise men and magicians can interpret for him. And Joseph is called through the wine steward, called to Pharaoh, and correctly interprets Pharaoh's dreams and counsels him. And that's an incredible picture. That Egypt will have 7 years of bountiful harvest, so there are the 7 fat cows and the 7 full head of grain picture that is given there. And then 7 years of famine, where the skinny cows are eating the big fat cows, and the grain that's shriveling up is eating the heads of grain that are healthy and ready for harvest. And Joseph is brought to Pharaoh. He gets cleaned up, put on new clothes, he shaves. And the amazing thing about Joseph is this, that he makes the best of every opportunity. He understands the sovereignty of the Lord. He understands that God is always preparing us for the next opportunity. Because some of us, I think, even as Christians, want the way to be smooth, right? Here he is in his 20s. He's got a story to tell. He's gone from being the favorite son to being the most hated brother to being the most accused person in Egypt. And he goes through all of this stuff. There are times, I think, as Christians, that we kind of have this false belief that once we come to know Jesus, everything is going to be just smooth sailing. There'll be blessings, there'll be this, there'll be that. And then the first bad thing happens to us, or somebody does something to us, and then we're just like crushed. I see this at times with kind of what happens in our school system these days, where people graduate from a program, or they have all the knowledge about a certain program, and then they're looking for a job, and they're in their 20s, and it's a very hard time knowing what the next steps are. And they get out of that, their parents have helped them, they might even have some debt now as a result of it, and so things get very complicated very fast. And we want it all to be like this, when it isn't. That's not the world we live in. I remember having a young man sit down with me, and he says, Pastor Rama, I've got an undergrad degree, I've got a master's degree, and I should be managing a large company by now. I go, what? You're kidding. I said, where have you worked all in the summers? Well, my parents have paid for all my education, so I haven't had to work. I said, that's not good, man. You haven't worked at all? Not a part-time job ever on your resume? No! I said, no wonder nobody wants to hire you. You got to go work. He said, what am I supposed to do? I said, well, actually, I have a friend right now who needs some laborers. We can go work. He said, I can't do that. I said, you got to do something. It's time to do something. And sometimes we miss out that God is preparing us for the next thing by us being faithful right now where we are. Maybe doing a job we don't like right now. But if we're faithful in it, God starts opening up other avenues for us because we're faithful where we are right now. We're just not counting the days anymore. We are seeking God every day instead. And then you see this destiny all happen. Right? Genesis 42 to 50. I mean, when you look at this, Joseph goes from prisoner to the palace. You go, boy, what a great Hollywood ending. Right? But that's not the end of the story. The destiny is amazing because here we see Joseph seeing the bigger picture of God's grace. He's united with and forgives his brothers, although he kind of does some things to test them there, right? I mean, if you know the story well as I do, you just kind of go, why is he doing this? And I think he's testing them as God tested him. And God uses that to kind of convict his brothers because there's kind of a point in time where they go, this is all happening. Remember what we did to our brother? Now we're kind of reaping the consequences for all of this. And you just see it. Right? And the amazing thing is, as you get into the story, there's this point in time where Joseph just can't take it anymore. He sent them away, they've come back, he's put silver in their sacks, he sends them away again with Benjamin, and there's the cup, and his dad's freaking out, and he can't take it anymore. And he tells his staff to leave, and he speaks to his brothers in their own language. And he tells them who he is. And they're all bowing down. Joseph doesn't even really care. Because he just weeps and forgives them. That's his destiny. That's his destiny. The family is relocated to Egypt. Jacob and Joseph's lives are lived out the rest of their days there. After Jacob passes away, the brothers once again are coming in. They're bowing down because they know he could take it out on them, but Joseph has forgiven. And he says, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good. In fact, he says a little before that, in verses 19 to 21 of Genesis 50, who am I? Am I in the place of God? In God's plan, brokenness is always the beginning of God's greater plan of grace. To let go of our idols, so that God's redemptive plan happens through our brokenness if we just trust Him. Like Joseph, God's destiny for you and I is to impact future generations with His grace, His forgiveness, and His blessing, no matter what brokenness you've been through. His purpose, His destiny for us is to impact others with His grace, forgiveness, and blessing. Remember what the Apostle Paul says about us in 2 Corinthians 4:7? But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to our God and not to us. The picture the Apostle Paul has, and I was going to do this morning, get a couple of clay pots and break them all over the stage and stuff, but I got a new custodian and I don't really want to, offend him. But when I think about that illustration, we are just kind of clay pots that are broken very easily by sin and what happens to us. Sometimes the big lie that we have is that we can rebuild our lives by ourselves. Well, we can't. Because I could break a clay pot here today and try to re-glue it all together and try to sell it to you for $10, but you wouldn't buy it from me because it would not be, it'd be still in pieces. Pieces jutting out. You couldn't put anything in it. It would leak all over the place. And what I understand from Joseph's life is this. That brokenness, whether it's by our own sin, by the sin of others, only points us to a Savior that we all desperately need, and that's Jesus Christ and His plan for your life. We cannot reconstruct our lives by ourselves. Only Jesus can help us, truly help us, to forgive our brokenness, no matter what it is. And you see this in Joseph's life. Yeah, the first 17 years were great with his dad because he was the favorite, but it ended up that really he wasn't the favorite of his brothers, and he goes through all of this stuff in his early 20s. Brokenness, till he's just satisfied with God and what God's going to do. And for the next 60 years of his life, he's this dude in Egypt that has fulfilled his destiny of saving his family. For those of us who know Jesus Christ today, I want to emphasize to you, your brokenness can be forgiven by the Lord, and He can reconstruct our lives in such a way that we can show the grace and forgiveness and mercy and love of Jesus Christ to the rest of our family that desperately needs it. But we just let Him. Because all of our families are broken without Jesus. They just are. And no matter what you're going through, the brokenness you're going through in your own personal life or in the life of your family, God's message through Joseph is this: I'm bigger than all the brokenness. I want to put things back together. Yeah, sometimes it will take time. It will take trusting me. It will take avoiding evil so that I can continue to do good in your life. And allow holiness to bring healing. Because holiness brings healing through Jesus. And when we follow Jesus, He takes our brokenness and starts to rebuild and bring us to the place where we can only say ourselves, Lord, these people meant it for evil. And I'm sure that maybe even Joseph said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Because Jesus said it too. And that's why we can come to Jesus, to restore us, to rebuild us, and give us what we need. But we need to do that through a life of spiritual integrity with Jesus through the wilderness. Let's pray. Father, as we close this morning, thank you for the message of Joseph. For some of us, we've heard it many times. For others, it's fresh, it's new. He lived a life that showed your grace through very terrible things. And Lord, there are many people here today, too, who've lived through very many terrible things, but can testify to your grace and love, mercy, and rebuilding in their lives. Father, may we have spiritual integrity, whether we're younger or older. Because we're all going to experience some sort of broken dreams, death of a dream. But I pray, Father, that you would just enable us to follow you in that way and stand strong for you. So whether we're in the dugout, in the dungeon, whether we've had disastrous things happen to us, we understand that you have a bigger dynasty, your kingdom, and that you have a destiny for us to assist you in reaching out and saving your families. In Jesus' name.